Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to wonder what your emotions actually are?
You mean like underneath the feeling itself?
Exactly. Not just the feeling, but the fundamental building blocks. What if joy, sadness, anxiety, even that flash of curiosity weren't just abstract concepts or electrical signals?
But we're literally constructed
Hmm.
from fundamental particles.
Yeah, following rules that borrow from quantum physics.
Well, that's pretty much the premise of this really unique and frankly mind-bending model we're exploring today.
The quantum emotional framework, or QEF?
That's the one. The sources we're diving into describe it as a practical, fantastical way of seeing emotions, not just as feelings, but as these dynamic quantum phenomena.
With their own elementary particles and structures, apparently.
hmm
Exactly. So our mission with this deep dive is to, explore the stack of sources and really pull out the core ideas behind this fascinating proposal.
Right.
We're going to look at the proposed fundamental particles, things called primes, selfons, and awarons.
And we'll step into the proposed personal quantum soup, where all this happens, the experience reservoir,
Or the soup. Come
and
on.
see how these particles are thought to combine into stable units of emotion, which they call emotoms.
Emotoms. And then how these emotoms are supposedly classified on a sort of emotional periodic table.
Yeah, with some pretty interesting dimensions like mingleness versus singleness,
Uh-huh.
and this weight factor that's tied to subjectivity,
Okay, and crucially, how awareness or consciousness fits in.
which the model represents with alarms, yeah.
Yeah.
How they attach to these emotoms to create what we consciously feel.
Right, and then how the brain fits in as like a processor.
How memory works in this framework,
And this really intriguing idea of a feedback loop.
where your thoughts might actually influence the very quantum soup your emotions are made from.
Whoa. Okay. So we're essentially taking something we all experience every single day, our emotional landscape,
Hmm.
and looking at it through a completely new lens. Borrowing ideas from physics, biology, chemistry, it's definitely a different way to map the territory of feeling.
Absolutely.
Settle in, because this deep dive invites you to see your inner world from, well, a quantum perspective. Let's jump in with the proposed basic ingredients.
Right, so the sources start by proposing that everything we feel, fundamentally, is built from just three core types of particles.
Three basic building blocks. Okay, first up,
First up are the primes.
primes.
These are described as the absolutely fundamental, kind of indivisible qualities that make up emotions. Things like lack, resignation, possession, anticipation.
Value, expectancy, equilibrium. Sounds like core concepts.
Exactly. Think of them as the structural scaffolding, or maybe the basic flavors available for emotion.
The raw qualities.
Yeah, and the sources suggest these primes are like the elementary particles in physics, the quarks or bosons of emotion.
Okay.
What's fascinating is he proposed that these aren't just abstract concepts, but actual particles with specific quantum orientations.
Like poles on a magnet.
Sort of. Or maybe more like emotional polarities that determine how they interact and bond with each other. Very much like atomic valency dictates how atoms form molecules in chemistry.
So they have rules of engagement, how they link up.
Precisely. It sets the rules for building emotional structures.
Okay, so primes are the structural bits with rules for bonding. Then there are selfons.
Selfons, yeah. These are described as particles representing individual self-essence, or immersion.
The me part of the feeling.
Kind of, yeah. The model suggests they emerge from biochemical reactions in living beings, so that grounds the subjective you in biology.
But they're unstable.
Very. Left to themselves, the sources say they're inherently unstable, like free radicals in chemistry, prone to rapid decay.
Okay, unstable self-essence particles. And the third type,
Awarons.
Awaronsons.
These are proposed as particles of pure awareness or consciousness.
Just awareness itself.
Pure awareness. The sources give them a different origin story than selfons, suggesting they might emerge spontaneously from the quantum realm itself.
Oh, interesting. Hinting that awareness could be, like, fundamental to the universe.
Potentially. But similar to selfons, awarons are also described as highly unstable and fleeting when they are alone.
Okay, so you have these three kinds of unstable fundamental ingredients structure primes, selfins, and awareness awarons. Where do they all mix and interact to actually form an emotion?
Right, that's the job of the experience reservoir.
The reservoir.
The sources describe this as a dynamic, unique quantum field within every individual. It's the personal space where the synthesis of emotion actually happens.
Your own personal quantum field.
Exactly. They use some vivid analogies for this. A quantum soup, a fish farm within a quantum ocean.
A quantum fish farm of self. I like that image. Okay. So what's floating around in this personal soup?
It's basically everything. It's a collection of broken down primes, selfons, and awarons derived from your entire life experience.
So sensory inputs.
Sensory inputs, the psychological schemas and beliefs you've developed, past emotional events, and critically, even your ongoing thoughts. It all feeds in.
Okay, so it's constantly being stirred and added to by everything you encounter and everything you process mentally.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, kind of the why it matters part.
Yeah.
The state of this soup isn't just a passive reflection of your life.
It's active.
Its current composition directly influences which emotional structures can form next and how. A deeply ingrained belief or a recent powerful experience literally changes the recipe of the soup.
Which alters your potential emotional responses going forward.
Precisely.
Fascinating. Okay, so the raw ingredients are in the soup, constantly changing. How do they come together to create something we recognize as a specific emotion, something stable?
Okay, this is where the Emotoms come in.
The Emotoms.
They are proposed as the fundamental stable units of emotion, the atoms of an emotion, as the sources put it.
The stable building blocks?
Yeah. Remember those unstable selfons, the self-stuff particles?
The ones that decay quickly.
Right. They can only achieve temporary stability by getting caught and held together by the specific bonding rules and quantum orientations of the primes.
Ah, so the primes basically form a kind of stabilizing net or structure around the selfins.
Yes, precisely. The sources describe this as a topological net. Imagine the primes forming the vertices or connection points and the bonds being the edges.
Like a little cage.
Kind of. This stable prime selfin configuration is an emotom. It's this structure that prevents the selfins from decaying rapidly.
Okay.
It's a direct analogy to how atoms form stable molecules through chemical bonding based on their valency and geometry.
Yeah.
Primes provide structure, selfins provide the self-core.
And together they form a stable unit, an emotom.
Exactly.
The sources also mention this prime net has a unique 3D metaball mesh-like topology.
Yeah, like those merging blobby shapes.
And that emotoms can even react and merge with other emotoms to form complex structures, like molecules.
Yes, which sounds just like those metaball shapes merging together. It indicates that emotions aren't isolated islands, but can combine and interact.
Forming more complex feelings.
Right. And the sources suggest these emotional bonds can have constructive or destructive effects, even referencing Feynman's sum over paths concept from quantum mechanics.
Wow. Any examples?
They give examples like hesitation potentially forming a complex doubt polymer, or combining care and trust leading to a love polymer.
A doubt polymer. Okay. And what about something like emotional breakdown? How might this model view that?
That's a really interesting application. The sources describe that as potentially happening when the delicate balance within an emototom is lost.
Wow.
Specifically, if the prime net, the structural part, weakens or maybe loses some primes.
Linkage gets damaged.
Right. The force holding the selfin core isn't strong enough anymore, and selfins can literally shoot out from the net.
Shoot out.
Yeah. In an attempt to stabilize the emototom, apparently.
Yeah.
The force of these escaping selfins might be absorbed if the surrounding prime net is still strong.
But if not?
They can collide with each other within the reservoir, potentially causing the felt experience of emotional harm or disarray.
It's a powerful visual for losing structural integrity in your emotional state. Selfins shooting out.
Yeah.
Wow.
It really paints a picture.
So we have these stable emotoms formed from primes and selfins, but how does consciousness, the awarenons, the particles of awareness, actually fit into this and make us feel the emotion?
Okay, this is maybe the most crucial step in the model. Consciousness, or our subjective awareness of an emotion, only emerges when awarons attach themselves to a stable emotom structure.
So awarons don't just attach to the raw, free-floating selfins or primes in the soup.
No, that's a key detail the sources emphasize. Awarons are attracted to selfins, it's the self they connect with.
Right.
But they cannot directly pair up because both are unstable on their own.
Okay.
The stable prime net within the emotom is the essential intermediary. It stabilizes the selfin in a specific configuration that makes it visible and available for awarons to attach.
So the stable emotom provides the landing pad for consciousness.
It's a good way to put it, yes.
And this attachment is what creates our conscious experience of feeling that specific emotion. Okay. But if it's based on these discrete particle interactions, how does our experience feel so seamless, so continuous and live?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes down to the proposed speed of this quantum process.
It's fast.
Incredibly fast. The whole sequence, emotom formation, awaron attachment, And then the subsequent reading or perception of that emotum configuration happens at an incredibly rapid, superfine quantum
Hey,
speed.
how fast are we talking?
The sources quantify this as millions in a flash.
Millions of these Orman emotum perceptions happening almost instantaneously.
Exactly. It's analogous to how a movie reel works. Individual still frames projected so rapidly.
24 frames per second, usually.
Right, but here it's at a quantum rate of millions in a flash that they create the subjective illusion of continuous motion, a smooth, flowing gradient of experience.
Ah, so that's the proposed reason why the self and awareness feel inseparable and constant.
It's live, babe, as the
Mm.
sources playfully put it.
Ah, okay.
And this concept, it resonates interestingly with discussions in quantum physics about observation and also neuroscience's attempts to solve the binding problem, how all these separate brain activities create one unified conscious experience.
Okay, so we have stable emotoms forming, Awarons attaching at lightning speed, creating this seamless stream of conscious feeling. With potentially so many different emotoms possible based on the combinations of primes and the self-density, how does the model organize them? Is there a system?
Yes, that's where the emotional periodic table comes in.
Like the chemical one?
Exactly like that,
I really
conceptually.
did.
The sources suggest organizing emotoms along two primary dimensions or axes based on their properties.
Okay, what are the axes?
The x-axis is the mingleness-singleness gradient.
Mingleness versus singleness. What does that mean?
It describes the inherent relational nature of the underlying primes and how that influences the atmosphere or feel of the resulting emotion.
Okay.
So on the left-wing side, you have the mingleness primes like lack, resonation, anticipation, and possession.
Lift wing, mingleness.
These are described as being highly reactive, outwardly focused, and prone to combining and entangling with other emotoms or external events.
And the emotoms formed from these mingleness primes have a dense, opaque topology.
Right. The sources call them Venusian emotoms.
Like the planet Venus.
Yeah, because like the thick atmosphere of Venus, they could obscure or make it difficult to see the individual self core beneath.
Ah, okay. Hidden self.
And the sources link this mingling property to states like submissiveness, when these emotoms have a high density of selfons, giving them weight.
Heavy and mingling. Submissive.
But interestingly, they can also manifest as forceful dominance when combined with a specific drive for leadership, like insecurity, which they describe as a heavy lack emotom driving aggressive behavior.
Wow, okay, so that's the left side. Reactive metalness property, they said.
And then on the right wing is singleness.
Singleness.
These are emotoms formed from primes like value, expectancy, and equilibrium. They're described as more internally coherent, self-contained, and maybe principle-driven.
Internally focused.
Right. And their emotoms are proposed to have a translucent topology.
Translucent, like the thin, clear atmosphere of Mars. Martian.
Exactly. Martian emotoms. This translucency, where you can apparently see the self and core more clearly, is correlated with qualities associated with leadership in the sources.
Clear self-possession and purpose.
Right. And the equilibrium group specifically is compared to noble gases on the chemical table.
Ah, because they're naturally self-contained and stable feelings.
Pretty much. So the x-axis is really about how reactive and outwardly focused the emotion tends to be and how much it obscures the sense of self within it. Mingling Venus versus singular Mars.
Okay, mingleness versus singleness on the x-axis makes sense. What about the y-axis?
The y-axis is the weight and objectivity subjectivity gradient.
Weight and subjectivity.
This dimension primarily reflects the self and density within an emotom. How many selfons are packed in?
So the weight of the emotion literally comes from how much of your self stuff, your selfons, is bound up in it.
Precisely. The self and core is the weight part. The bottom of the table represents heavier emotoms.
Higher concentration or count of selfons.
Right. Emotions down there are intensely subjective, deeply personal. These are the feelings where the self feels most immersed or entangled.
Like grief, shame, despair, loneliness, or deep insecurity. Yeah, that really resonates. They feel very heavy and personal.
Definitely. Compared to the top of the table, which is lighter, indicating lower self and density.
Less self-stuff involved.
Yeah. These emotions are proposed to be more objective, less intensely about the self, and more about external phenomena or universal principles.
Like curiosity, surprise, or awe. You're usually curious about something. Surprised by something, it feels less about your inner self.
Exactly. The sources use hunger versus insecurity as a prime example. Hunger is a lighter commodum, less emotum, less self-intense.
You feel it, but it's about a physical need.
Right. Versus insecurity, which is a much heavier lacumotum, deeply infused with selfons, making it intensely personal and weighty.
That clarifies the y-axis difference really well. Weight equals subjectivity.
And they also note that this significant clump of selfons giving weight can lead to a kind of radioactivity,
Radioactive.
giving the emotion power. But this power, they suggest, can become toxic if it's surrounded by negatively energized Awarons.
Negatively energized Awarons. Wait, the sources mention Awaron has positive, ground, and negative levels.
Yes. The base or ground level is maybe when you're not consciously aware of the emotum.
Yeah.
An energized Awaron state is when you consciously feel it.
Okay.
And the sources propose that the positive and negative levels of Awaron attachment might explain the inherent duality some emotions seem to have.
Like two sides of the same coin.
Sort of. The ability to look at another view or feel different valences of the same underlying emotional structure.
Can you give an example?
They suggest a negative Awaron state of confident might become bold, or satiate could become fed up.
So awareness itself can provide different interpretive lenses on the same emotom base.
That's the idea. Positive or negative charge on the awareness.
That's really thought-provoking. Okay, so we have particles forming a soup, combining into stable emotoms, consciousness attaching via Awarons, and a periodic table to classify them. Where does the brain fit in? What does our physical organ actually do in this QEF framework?
Right, this is a really key part of the model's proposal. The sources define the brain not as the primary generator of these fundamental emotional quanta.
It doesn't make the primes or selfons or emotoms.
No, it's positioned more as a sophisticated interface and processing unit.
An interface.
We give a pretty colorful description. A quantum in sync disposal.
A quantum in sync disposal. Okay, that's a very memorable phrase.
It is. The idea is the brain receives the signal from the resolved emotom-Awaron connection.
It gets the output.
Yeah, what the Awaron is perceiving is the live broadcast of feeling. The brain then takes the signal and translates it into higher-level neural activity.
And that's what leads to...
That's the process that results in our conscious thoughts about the emotion, the physiological responses we feel like a racing heart or butterflies, and the complex behaviors we exhibit in response.
So the fundamental feeling happens at the quantum level, in the reservoir with the emotom-Awaron link, and the brain is the powerful translator and response engine.
Exactly. It processes the quantum feed.
And memory, how does that fit in? Is memory stored in the soup?
No. Memory, in this framework, is described as records of the broadcast.
Records of the broadcast.
It's the brain encoding and storing neural representations of those past emotom-Awaron experiences. It's not storing the original live quantum stream itself.
But the brain's processing and translation of it, its interpretation.
Exactly. And this distinction, they suggest, explains why our memories of emotions can be imperfect, reconstructed, and sometimes feel different from the original intensity or nuance of the experience.
Because it's a recording, not a live feed playback.
Precisely. You're remembering the brain's output, not the quantum input directly.
That's a really important distinction. The experience is the quantum event. The memory is the brain's recording of its output.
Exactly. And this leads directly into one of the most dynamic and, I think, intriguing concepts in the model, the feedback loop.
Which the sources also call the thought drain.
Yes.
The idea that our thoughts actually influence the soup itself.
Yes, and this is powerful because it suggests agency, real influence.
How does it work?
The sources state that the brain's higher-level processes, our deliberate thoughts, our reflections on experiences, the new interpretations we form, the lessons we learn, aren't just an endpoint.
They go somewhere.
The information processed from that broadcast stream by the brain is actively re-quantized, or dumped back down, as they phrase it.
Dumped back down.
Into the experience reservoir.
Into the soup. So your conscious thinking process is constantly adding new material, new structure back into that fundamental quantum soup.
Precisely. This active feedback loop is proposed to continually update and modify the reservoir's composition.
That's the core mechanism for learning, then, for emotional adaptation.
That's how they frame it. Processing trauma, integrating new information. It directly shapes the synthesis of future emotoms by changing the soup's ingredients.
It connects the abstract process of thinking directly back to the proposed fundamental building blocks of feeling.
Yeah, it really does suggest significant potential agency in shaping our inner world over time. It also aligns, in a way, with ideas from control systems theory and cognitive neuroscience about how reflection alters neural pathways.
But grounds it in this proposed quantum reality.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. And the sources add some other fascinating details linked to quantum properties, right? Like the resonation prime.
Oh, yeah, that's a cool one. Because the quantum realm is proposed to be non-time and non-space.
Right.
A strong resonation prime in an emotom might explain those feelings of resonating deeply with past events, or feeling a connection that seems timeless or without physical distance.
Like feeling a sudden, powerful pang of empathy or connection to something that happened years ago or maybe far away. That weird sense of connection.
That could be one interpretation within this model, yes. Or the feeling of hesitation itself.
Hesitation.
Yeah.
How's that quantum?
The sources suggest this might emerge from the superposition property of the quantum realm,
Hmm.
the state of existing in multiple possibilities at once.
Being in two minds.
Kind of. A strong hesitation emotom might represent being in a superposition of potential actions or feelings before collapsing into a decided state.
Huh. Interesting take. And those deeply strange, sometimes indescribable emotions, like people report during near-death experiences or maybe hallucinogenic states.
Right. The sources suggest these could potentially arise from highly rare, uncommon configurations of the prime net,
Weird emotum.
perhaps triggered by the extreme conditions of those unusual events. Configurations that don't correspond to the typical well-defined emotoms we experience daily and classify on the periodic table.
Making them feel utterly alien and hard to describe with our usual emotional vocabulary.
Exactly. They're off the standard map, so to speak.
This framework really does offer a complex, multi-layered view. It's trying to integrate concepts across physics, biology, psychology in a very unique way.
It really is.
Yeah.
What's truly fascinating here is how it tries to provide a potential underlying mechanism, how, for phenomena we experience constantly but often struggle to define scientifically.
Like subjective feeling itself, consciousness.
Even nuanced states like empathy or indecision. It's a bold proposal for sure, a different way to map the inner landscape.
Okay, so let's recap. We've taken a deep dive into this practical, fantastical, quantum emotional framework proposed in these sources, explored its fundamental components.
Hmm.
We started with the proposed particles, primes, as the structural qualities,
The scaffolding,
selfons as the self-essence, the me bit,
unstable on their
and
own.
Awarons as pure awareness, all interacting within your personal quantum soup, the experience reservoir.
Right. We saw how these ingredients combine with prime stabilizing selfons to form emotoms,
Yeah.
stable units.
And that Awaron attaches to these stable emotoms, creating our conscious perception of emotion.
And it happens incredibly fast, millions in a flash, creating that subjective illusion of a seamless, continuous experience, that feeling that it's live, babe.
Yeah. And how these emotoms get classified on that intriguing periodic table.
Left-wing mingleness, opaque, reactive Venusian,
Right-wing, singleness, translucent, self-contained, Martian.
and the y-axis mapping weight based on self-oscistances.
Which correlates with how subjective and personal the emotion feels, heavier for deep grief or insecurity, lighter for objective curiosity or awe.
Yeah. And we touched on some specific, really striking details from the sources.
Like emotional breakdown being visualized as self-and shooting out from a destabilized prime net.
Or the idea of the resonation prime connecting us across time and space via the quantum realm.
And how indescribable emotions, like from NDEs, might come from rare, non-standard prime configurations.
We also mentioned how the weight from selfons gives power to an emotion, which can be radioactive or toxic when coupled with negative Awaron states.
Right, while the positive-negative Awaron levels might explain the duality of feeling the ability to look at another view on the same emotional structure.
And even considering hesitation as a potential reflection of quantum superposition,
And we saw the brain's proposed role not as the generator,
but as the powerful processor of this live broadcast, the quantum in-sync disposal.
translating the Awaron signal into our thoughts and actions, with memory serving as the brain's recorded records of the broadcast.
Not the live feed itself,
Finally, we circled back to that crucial feedback loop, the thought drain.
where the brain's processing our thoughts, reflections, memories is proposed to be requantized and fed back into the experience reservoir.
Actively and constantly updating that fundamental soup from which future emotions emerge.
It's a continuous cycle.
Okay, so here is a provocative thought to leave you with, building on this whole model. If our thinking processes, our conscious reflections, and our memories are constantly updating the very quantum field from which our emotions are synthesized.
Dumping back into the soup.
Yeah, what does this model imply about the power we might possess over time and with conscious effort to actually influence and shape the fundamental building blocks of our own emotional landscape?